Okay, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to use up to that amount of time. I don't think
Senator from South Dakota is recognized without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And again, to my colleague from Tennessee, I would thank him for his leadership on this issue, and particularly for bringing to the forefront of the debate the housing issue, which, as so many have mentioned already, really is an integral, essential part of a solution. If we don't deal with that, then we really aren't going to, I think, lead our country out of the recession that we're in, and it's clearly, I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that housing played a very important role in where we are today, and trying to recover is going to require, I think, a good amount of focus and attention on that issue, which in this bill is very, very light. In fact, if you look at what's included in the bill, let me see here, 1% of the Senate bill goes toward fixing housing. And even the 15,000 new homebuyer credit that was reportedly cut in half in the final version of the bill. And I'm told, and I don't know the answer to this because I've not seen the final bill, nor has I think any of us have seen the details in it, that entire housing tax credit may in fact be gone, which would eliminate really any commitment to helping to repair that aspect of our economy, the housing sector of the economy, which is going to be so important, I think, in helping us recover. So 1% of the Senate bill goes toward housing currently. 2.3% of the Senate bill goes toward small business tax relief. And as I mentioned before, small businesses create 2/3 to 3/4 of all the new jobs in our economy. It seems to me, at least, that ought to be a very proper and important focus of this legislation. And of course, some of the alternatives that we voted on last week, one of which was the McCain alternative, which we referenced earlier, did include a significant amount of incentive for small businesses to invest and to create jobs. And I offered a couple of tax amendments too, a couple of alternatives to the bill, which really did focus on tax relief for middle-income families and for small businesses. That, of course, was defeated as well. I guess my point is that the bill, as we have it in front of us, is going to be very much oriented towards spending, and spending on government programs, and spending which in many cases doesn't go away, that isn't temporary, that in fact makes obligations and commitments and liabilities well into the future. And we talked about up to about $200 billion of the funding in the bill being what we call mandatory spending. In other words, spending that is built into the baseline, that isn't temporary, and hard to see how that fits into the definition of temporary, targeted, and timely, which was the criteria that was set out by the President and by the Democrat leadership in developing this bill in the first place. The senator from Tennessee, when he touched upon the amount of money that his state of Tennessee will receive and what the stated need is, and I would repeat what I said earlier, that under this bill, we're not giving states what they've estimated their amount is to cover the increased Medicaid enrollment due to the economic downturn. We're giving them, if you can believe this, almost 8 times the amount of money they would need just to cover additional enrollment due to the economic downturn. Why? Well, states, of course, aren't going to refuse it. I mean, which governor out there is going to turn down additional resources? But it's estimated that states would need about $11 billion in additional funding to cover enrollment-driven growth in state Medicaid programs. But under this bill, we provide $87 billion with absolutely no strings attached, and no requirement that states get their own spending and fraud and abuse under control. So I think we've hopefully pointed out and have before, but we'll continue to point out the ways in which the funding under this bill is being spent. And again, I've mentioned some of the particular earmarks here, much of which goes to government agencies, and the $20 million for the removal of fish barriers, $300 million for new cars for government workers, and I mentioned the $645 million for new and repaired facilities at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, $750 million for the new computer center for the Social Security Administration. Hard to argue, Mr. President, that these things really are stimulus. These are things perhaps that are needed, and in fact perhaps ought to be debated, but it ought to be debated in regular order. It ought to be handled through the normal annual appropriations process, not included in a bill that is being sold, I think, to the American people as stimulating the economy and creating jobs. There's very little in here that I can see that actually meets that definition. And I want to make one final point, if I might, with regard to the whole issue of job creation, because the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, in their letter dated February 11th in 2009, clearly describes the false economic theories behind this government spending bill. The CBO letter encompasses the majority of economists' views on this legislation, and specifically, the letter states that beyond the year 2014, the legislation is estimated to reduce gross domestic product by between up to 0.2%. The reduction in GDP is therefore estimated to be reflected in lower wages rather than lower employment. Workers will be less productive because the capital stock is smaller. The legislation's long-run impact on output also would depend on whether it permanently changed incentives to work or save. The legislation would not have any significant permanent effects on those incentives. So those are all quotes from the CBO letter that came out last week. And so even the most optimistic CBO projection states that the long-run GDP growth will increase by 0%. So the most optimistic projection is built on an assumption that all of the relevant investments together would, on average, add as much to output as would a comparable amount of private investment. In other words, the government spending included in the House and Senate stimulus bills doesn't change GDP at all due to government spending crowding out private investment. And I think most of us would agree, at least I think most of us on this side would agree, that we're much better served in terms of creating economic growth and jobs and seeing that those jobs are created in the private sector and that we're providing the necessary incentives for investment in new jobs. And this bill is very light on the types of incentives that would lead small businesses to go out and to invest and to do the sorts of things that actually will create jobs and help us recover and build a better and more prosperous future for our children and grandchildren, which, as I said earlier, in my view, is in serious jeopardy because of this legislation, primarily because of the enormous amount of borrowing that it includes and how much it adds to that debt that every man, woman, and child in America today owns. $35,000 is that share of the debt, and under this bill, that would grow by $2,700 per man, woman, and child in America. And so what we are doing to future generations is wrong. It is not fair to them. This government needs to learn to live within its means, and we need to think about building and sacrificing so that the children and grandchildren, so that future generations have a brighter future, the way that it has always been in this country. It's always been part of our culture, part of our ethic, that we work hard, we sacrifice so that future generations, our children and grandchildren, can have a brighter and a better future. This completely turns that whole history, that whole legacy that we have as a nation on its head by asking future generations to sacrifice for us. That's the wrong thing to do, Mr. President, and I hope that we will reject this legislation, go back to the drawing board, do something that is effective, that does create jobs, that does work, and that will give the American taxpayer a good return on their investment, and I yield the floor.